Peter, thank you, and thank you very much to the two institutions hosting this event. It's a great pleasure to be back at Brookings, and there's a particular pleasure in today's event being bracketed effectively by my own talk and by Moisen's talk. Moisen and I go back 30 years, and he introduced me to my wife. So, yeah. And we're still married, I should add. So it's a great pleasure, really, to continue this discussion. What I'm going to do in the time we have is race through some of the general work we've done at the LSE on cities around the world, and then I will focus on the London Olympics as a project which I think brings together many of the themes which are going to be addressed in later panels today. Not necessarily as a sales pitch, it's happened, it's there, and we can all draw our own conclusions from it, but more as a methodology of working, which I think might be useful and instructive for discussion further on. Now, what I'm going to talk about is very much framed by work that we've done now for over 6 or 7 years at the LSE, at LSE Cities, which is a center which is very interdisciplinary, as already described, and therefore draws on work which tries to understand this process of change and the importance, as has been stressed already by Peter, between the physical world and the social world in all these very, very different environments. And it's entitled, this talk and much of the work we do, The Endless City, because the city is endless. Where's the end of the city? It's Mexico City, but it could go on, the camera could go left, right, up, down, and it would never end. And the issue here, as Dan Sujic, my co-editor of the book, in thinking of the title, wanted to stress, it's endless not just as a physical artifact itself in some parts of the world, but also endless as a sort of process. Cities are joining up in regions and making mega regions that we didn't know of before. But there are choices, and that's what this whole conference is about. We don't have to keep on going this way. We know what the negative consequences of Mexico City, another view of it. When I took this picture a number of years ago, we know that if I went back in that particular slot, the whole of the green bit would have disappeared, with very negative consequences on the environment, on commuting patterns, in a city which more or less still today has something like 4 hours average commuting time. We'll hear about Sao Paulo and other cities before. Just remember that, 4 hours. Hong Kong, it's 11 minutes. Right? Those are the differences we're talking about. And we have choices to which way we go, how we design our environment, with very, very important consequences in terms of the human relationships within them. And if we have time, we'll talk about later, what does it actually mean to live here in a 35-story block, a few inches away, so to speak, from another building. It makes one of the most efficient cities in the world, but some of the work we've done at the LSE is actually, we created focus groups with people who live here. And the stories you hear about individuals and their sort of psychological relationship to their neighbors and to others are really quite drastic. So it's trying to really connect these two worlds of the physical, the sustainable, but very much what happens at the human scale, which is what we're very interested in. And I want to bring it, in a way, down to the ground, because, you know, here's another city which had choices over the last 100 or 200 years of how to organize itself in space. A rather messy city, and I'll talk about that in many ways, even though here it looks nearly as good as Paris. But it had to take choices. It had to make choices, and the politicians today are making choices which I would say are quite brave and quite innovative at the level of governance, at the level of design, and at the level of transport. So I think relevant to this discussion. And I will conclude by talking in some detail about how an area which for 200 years was really a backwater of London, a very necessary backwater, as all industrial cities have had to have those, how it's being translated, transmuted into this sort of piece of city over the next 20, 30 years. Let's just frame a discussion. You know, many of you just looking across the room know these statistics, but important to remind ourselves. Cities today, that is any sort of unit over 50,000 or so inhabitants, produce, of course, around, consume about 60–70% of the world's energy. It's because they are active places where people go to work and do things. But together they also contribute to something like 75% of CO2 emissions. So small changes, literally small changes, 2–3% in your CO2 footprint make a big difference to the planet. Hence the examples we'll hear about later. And something we're not stressing today, but I think we should always remember, it's not just an environmental impact. There's a dramatic social impact of these cities as they grow, because in Sao Paulo, but also elsewhere, and I'm not picking out Sao Paulo as a negative today as an example, but there are many things about it which perhaps don't work. You are confronting situations where now the 7th economy in the world, just overtaken the United Kingdom, with enormous wealth, faces these realities and the conditions you see here. On the left-hand side, you have informal settlement of favelas with little water and little infrastructure. On the right-hand side, you have new housing where the wealth is so great that every single resident has a swimming pool on each terrace. You know, is that the way to go? And given that 1 in 3 of every new urban dweller is going to be living in an informal settlement in a slum, there is a real question. Where all this problem is, in a way, focusing itself is clear. I mean, many of the choices of who's speaking here today reflect that. But what you see in this map, which we produced at the LSE a few years ago, is pretty straightforward. In dark green, in the middle of the circles, you see in all these cities more or less where growth was concentrated effectively over my lifetime, in the first 30, 40 years of my life, so from the 50s on. In the lighter green, and therefore, obviously, Europe, parts of the United States, that's where the major growth happened. In the lighter green is where most of the growth was concentrated in the 60s and 70s, and in the white is where the growth is going to be concentrated over there. Now, there's another way of talking about this. Every minute and a half that I'm talking to you, there's a new person who's either born or moved into Lagos, many of the cities that the President was talking about before, the Chancellor was talking about before that he's been visiting, in India or Africa. Every minute and a half there's a new person actually moving into these cities or being born there. And think of the strain on the infrastructure, just on schools, on sewers, on everything else. So it's a very, very specialized thing to be able to talk about sustainability in Copenhagen, London, and elsewhere. But I think lessons need to be drawn, and that's why I very much welcome today's event, which is very broad in its sort of geographical context. Because I'm from the LSE, I have to show some graphs, otherwise you wouldn't take me seriously, particularly at Brookings, and not just pictures. So I'm going to show you just a couple. And this, I think, is important for really for all of us. Along here is the Human Development Index of the UN. Basically, the better educated you are, better health quality, the better food, and higher unemployment, better wealth, the more you are along the right-hand side of this axis. And the vertical axis is instead the ecological footprint. Broadly speaking, I know it's much more detailed than this, how much energy you consume, broadly speaking. The dotted line is how much energy we consume in one Earth. So anything above the dotted line is in excess of one Earth's capacity, right? And what you see here, and you know, I don't want to be unkind to our hosts, is the way we're going, right? Yes, great quality of life, but terrible ecological footprint. And I think the issue for all of us here in studying cities is what can we do about, particularly in these cities and countries which are here at the moment, here and here, China in particular, Brazil, South America, as their HDI improves, which way are they going to go? Are they going to go there, or are they going to go here? And exactly why Copenhagen becomes an important model for so many of us. So that's really to frame the discussion, and some of the work we've done with other colleagues is about trying to understand issues of energy, issues of consumption, and the physicality. So a few examples, a few very concrete examples, and again, I don't want to beat up on Sao Paulo, so don't take this personally. But you know, I could have used Los Angeles, but I've been thrown out of this country immediately, I'm sure. But you know, that could work, or many other cities, Atlanta, or others. Washington, I don't know well enough. But what is interesting about this city and where the sort of ecological issues, the environmental issues, and the socials really come together is that you have an extraordinary, to me, city center. Extraordinary, in fact, quite beautiful. Most of it, for a number of years, emptied out because of fear, because of violence, and because of all sorts of other issues to do with property ownerships and other things. This city has grown exponentially, not as fast perhaps as others now, but nonetheless very, very fast for a period of years up to 15, 20 years ago. And basically the poor have been moved out, but really out, far out. Now this looks like a beautiful sort of lake. It isn't. It's actually the the water reservoirs of the city. Most of these places don't actually have efficient toilets or sewers. I need say nothing else about what happens to the quality of the water and the risks sort of associated with these things. Now, a lot is being done, of course, to deal with these issues, but this is the problem a mayor has to face with. The city of São Paulo has grown enormously in terms of its car industry. It's the engine of that nation. But how does it deal with the sort of consequences on the ground for people who live there? You know, if you have a car industry, as we've seen in parts of Europe, certainly the United States, you know, you promote this, even if it does take up to 4 hours to commute. So those who can afford to literally move around with helicopters, and this is not an exaggeration. There are roughly 1,000 helicopters, the same as in New York, the same as in Tokyo, in a city which at the moment GDP per person is considerably less. So that's not one way to deal with it. There are other ways. We could have, of course, had the mayor of Bogota or many other cities around the world. There are ways to deal with this in a sort of light touch way. Bogota, 7 million people, had a series of mayors who introduced the Transmilenio bus, dedicated lanes, cycleways which connect out into the sort of seeming wilderness to allow the informal city to actually grow around it. This is actually what it looks like after a couple of years. As a result, this man, instead of having to sit in a car for 3 or 4 hours a day or take a bus, actually takes his kids to school that way. Now, apart from the sustainability, Copenhagen, Danish-like lifestyles, which is a bit weird when you think of it in Bogota, being all good, for me, the most important thing, apart from saving the planet and all that, is the relationship between these three people. And it's a design issue. It's a choice. And that's why I think we're so interested in taking these discussions further. We've done some work with colleagues at the LSE and continuing to do it on, you know, what is the future? Do you need to go up that graph that I showed you before? And these examples, which are very clear, and I'm not going to go into it in detail because they're going to be discussed later also, basically show two very simple things, that as income per capita tends to grow, even in Berlin, right, but not that much, what has been happening is that basically energy levels and CO2 consumption per capita actually have dropped through policy initiatives, because people have had the courage to actually do something about it. We could have added New York to this, Alex, but maybe you'll talk about it later. And here is where design, as President Talbot mentioned before, Strobe mentioned before, here the issue of design and physicality and urbanism really comes to the heart of it. And Moisen's work, of course, in this field is absolutely fundamental. But creating place, creating density, bringing people closer together rather than keeping them apart, not only has social merits, but also has enormous environmental benefits. One of the new things that we've done recently is not only study density of population as we normally talk about it, which is residential density, which you see down here in the case of London. London is a low-density city compared to many of the other cities that we've studied around the world, but we've compared it to work density. That means how many people actually move on a daily basis to their place of work. And in London, for those of you who know it, it's really quite extraordinary to see how many people move, roughly 1 million a day, something like that, into the city of London, into the financial hub. But it means you have to have an infrastructure of movement that can deal with this efficiently. And in London, you could say we're quite lucky because we have had one for more than it was the 150th anniversary of the London Underground only a few weeks ago. So we have this sort of mature and very distributed system which supports this efficiently. London has an average commuting time of just about an hour, even though with these numbers. Now, interestingly, New York, much higher residential densities, you see it there, roughly the same number of people in London as in New York fit into half the space. It's a very interesting sort of dynamic. But look at that in terms of the New York sort of work density. And therefore, Hong Kong becomes extremely interesting with all the slightly negative things I said at the beginning, where these two are actually much closer. Residential on the left, work density on the right. You have to travel far less if the two are close to each other. So in terms of sustainability, and I'll come back to this, there are very few places that beat Hong Kong. It has an extraordinarily efficient system. Land is controlled rigorously and fiercely by actually the state, and property prices are extraordinarily high, and the density of living, the sheer amount of space you have to share with others is incredibly tight. But the effect is there. 93% of the population actually use public transport. 93% of the population, that means millionaires and billionaires, use public transport, something which also happens in London, maybe in New York, and certainly hardly anywhere else in the world. That's very important. And average commuting times are roughly 11 minutes. So what does all this mean for London? I want to spend the next 10, 15 minutes, Peter, if that's okay, on the London economy, on London's growth, and how the Olympics has been used, let's say, as a way to bring all these issues of sustainability meant very widely, including governance issue, together around the Olympics. Now, this is an important view. It's a view taken from the City of London, our financial hub, looking east, looking out towards the docks, the area that for generations, and everyone in this room will recognize this as a sort of problem that the post-industrial city faces, an area that for generations has been abandoned because of closure of the docks, because of containerization, all the sorts of issues that we clearly understand. And you see in the background Canary Wharf, a privately led development from the mid-1980s, enormously successful. 100,000 jobs were celebrated there only last year. That's extraordinary and been a very important part of London's global connectivity. This place is now doubling in size, and interestingly, with about 80,000 homes and with new offices. So, you know, there's a model of what might happen. Design-wise, and I say this with a certain amount of care, maybe not the best way to actually create a seamless, integrated piece of city. But, you know, we have to experiment, and London has been very innovative at doing things, and importantly, not necessarily the right way. And I think to learn from those lessons is important, and Canary Wharf itself is, I think, actually learning from those lessons of the past. Now, if I'd showed you a picture of Washington, New York, Barcelona, you'd immediately recognize, oh, there's the avenue, there's whatever. I show you this sort of grimy mess, it's London. That's what it is. What do you recognize in London? Well, maybe the brown thing called the River Thames, maybe Regent's Park, Hyde Park, Victoria Park, but little else. It's actually not a city which has been ever planned. Christopher Wren tried it in 1667 and failed. But there are very important elements that you can begin to recognize, and the River Thames and Canary Wharf, which I just looked at there, are significant. And this whole area over here is where the Olympics is actually was held, and the regeneration efforts are concentrated, is where I want to go back to. But when people talk about how do you regenerate, how do you actually create, accommodate the sort of growth that London is looking to in the next 10 or 20 years, if you just look at this picture, look at the amount of actually empty land that there is here, and I could continue all the way to the right. You can fit two Amsterdams here and here, right? And Amsterdam ain't a bad place to live, right? So it's interesting that those issues of density come into it. And the River Thames, these sort of expanses of the river as it goes to the east become very important in that. But London has done one important thing in terms of planning, which I think is the most precious gift that was given to us by Patrick Abercrombie in 1943, and that is the Green Belt. London stops at one point. Portland's got that, but very few other cities in the world have understood that. It's such a simple and fundamental concept. So when London in 2000 elected its first executive mayor, Ken Livingstone, for whom Richard Rogers and I worked, he took the fundamental decision that even though London was set to grow by 1 million people next year, that the Green Belt had to be reinforced, actually putting good pressure on redeveloping brownfield sites in the heart of the city and elsewhere. So simple things like that are very important. Another way of looking at London, which is really significant, is in terms of deprivation. Basically, the darker the color here, the less educated people are, the more teenage pregnancies, et cetera, et cetera. And if this were Chicago, it would be very clear what you would have. You'd have an absolutely clear divide between South and North. If it were New York, you would have the Bronx, perhaps Queens, actually standing out. And if it were Washington, I think, you all know better than me what that would look like. In London, it's interesting. It's sort of patchy. Basically, if you're living in the suburbs, you're fine. It's quite interesting. That's quite wealthy. If you're living in central areas, not that fine, and particularly in the east along the River Thames. So that was the first reason the politicians took the choice of spending $15 billion of public money for the Olympics right there. Might as well do it there than there or there. You're going to get much more political support. But let's not be cynical about politicians. Let's say they actually meant it, which I think they did. It turned out to actually work out very well. London is growing. It's becoming more and more cosmopolitan. Most people now moving into London are not born in London. They're not born in the UK. They're born outside. So we're trying to match probably New York and becoming a sort of a maximum city in terms of immigration. And it was actually fascinating that we just got the results of the 2011 census and found that we had 400,000 more people than we ever thought we had. 400,000. That's quite a lot in 10 years. And 98% of them were actually born outside the UK. Now, of course, that's led to one of the strongest things that London has been able to do over the years is actually to compete and do well at a period of global economic recession. London has also been innovative in the way it's actually governed itself. Only in 2000 did we decide we wanted to have an elected mayor. That's after 1,800 years that we didn't have one. So, you know, everything is possible. We don't have to be depressed that we're stuck with everything we want. We got this guy who wanted the maximum, then we get this guy who said he doesn't. But more or less, they broadly, Boris Johnson, our current mayor, they both believe in these important principles of making London as sustainable a city as possible. Unlike the mayor of New York, we're lucky that the mayor has total control over the whole transport system. There is no MTA, which sits somewhere else in another city in the state to decide what happens. That's why Ken Livingstone had the courage, and Boris Johnson more or less backed it, to introduce congestion charge, and he was not kicked out. There he is, smiling only a few years ago. That's why we did something in London that we hate to do, which is to follow the French. And we did that. But most importantly, in terms of this debate, we were able to create a London plan which basically is predicated on this diagram. I'm going to spend a few minutes on that and then move on to the Olympics. The London plan is the tool that develops the framework for future growth of the city. And very simple document. It's about 300 pages. And at the heart of this is a diagram. What it shows is that all growth has to stop at the green belt. I've already mentioned that, so it's reinforcing it. Secondly, it says we should promote growth, though, given that the population is going to grow, along these two axes, north and east and east. That is because that's where there's a lot of land and pretty good transport or improvements in transport. And then identified with the stars opportunity areas where density can be improved and increased. That's a very, very simple model of a sustainable sort of development. We stole it from Copenhagen and many other places. Nothing here is original, as you well know. Where these two corridors come together is exactly where the Olympics is, in fact, located. And not only does the London plan identify where growth is going to be residentially, but also where there's going to be growth in jobs. And as you can see here, it's all concentrated very much in these areas. So what did we actually do for the Olympics? You know, the event, 2 billion people watched it on television and liked it, on the whole. Some, particularly in the States, I gather, didn't really understand what the whole opening ceremony was about. And therefore put strange adverts in at the same time. But there's no doubt that it actually did succeed in making Londoners and visitors to London sort of also rethink the way the city actually was used and is being used and thought of itself. And the key diagram actually done by Kees Christianse, a colleague, a Dutch architect, when he won the competition for the Legacy Master Plan was this one. The Olympics is, by definition, for those 4 weeks, a closed event. We know that. How do you, the day after, make it into a porous, integrated, what Richard Sennett would say, an open piece of city? It's located, as I've shown you, not only in a place which needs attention, love, and investment, but also in actually one of the best internationally connected rail hubs of the UK. And it's also importantly connected to a beautiful waterway and green system which goes all the way up north across the UK. Connections in terms of tubes, underground buses is very, very good, and you can get into, let's call it more central London, within about 10 to 15 minutes. and great commuter services from outside. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of the next years, the Crossrail line, the equivalent of the underground high-speed Paris-like RER, which is under construction today, will link Heathrow Airport to this part of London in 35 minutes, which is an extraordinary change in terms of the sort of geography of London. This is a roughly £20 billion investment, partly funded by government and partly funded by the private sector. So let's look at the site. What you see in this picture is what it was like in 2003 when more or less we decided to bid for the games itself. Very importantly, you see a large amount of empty area, which was a railway goods yards. You see an extraordinary system of water canals and everything else going from the north, as I pointed out before, down to the river, which is at the bottom of the slide, and then large amounts of industrial land of the sort that you all recognize. These are pictures taken at the time. Actually, some parts really quite beautiful, surrounded by some of the most vibrant ethnic neighborhoods of London. Very, very different communities, different ethnicities, very vibrant nonetheless. One of the largest communities of artists anywhere in the world is concentrated just off the site. It had also the biggest fridge mountain in London. Every time I threw out a cooker, it ended up here. Think of what this means in terms of pollution of this site. Right? And it was crisscrossed by these major electricity pylons. Now, it sort of helps when you've got $15 billion that you can spend $300 million on undergrounding the wiring, effectively. Otherwise, nothing would have happened there. So, you know, that's the great advantage of sort of public investment. All the land was actually cleaned on site, and the whole project was about this. How can you take a piece of land which was in a way separated from the rest and reintegrate it with its surroundings? And I'm going to go through the scheme from the Olympics, what's actually happening now, and what will happen in the next few years. So there's the site. It has water. It has already some sort of park lands in the middle. So decision one, make a great park and call it Queen Elizabeth II, and you know, you win. So that was the first idea. You have a park with water right in the middle of it. That was a picture taken about 3 months before the game started. From that dump that I showed you, that's what actually was concluded. During the games, it was used like way, and the game plan is very simple. We want this to be as good a park as Regent's Park on its well. This was George Hargreaves, as it happened to the design, enormously successful project. The second thing, here's a site that was totally disconnected, had only one route across the site because it's a big industrial dump, you know, no one needed to go there. 38 new gateways, entrances, and connections, all, of course, funded through the sort of infrastructure that was allowable. Now, just look at this bridge here and the other bridges that you see there. When you have 200,000 people coming out of a stadium, you need very wide spaces, right? Because you have to deal with that sort of number. So many of the bridges were designed, and this costs more, to be oversized and then will be reduced. Today, the brown bit is being taken away, and you only have the white bits left, because the white bit is about the size of half this room, or 3/4 of this room, and it feels right for a sort of community, while that one doesn't feel right if it's for a sort of residential area. Then follow other things. Put jobs, put housing next to where the transport is, and many ways other things follow. A major shopping center, nothing to do with the Olympics, all private sectors, created already 10,000 jobs. 10,000 jobs for this area. This is a Westfield shopping center, an Australian group. And most of those jobs, particularly 6,000 of them, which are part-time, are for women who work in the area, many of them Asian. This has a massive impact on what is actually happening there. Very much a mixture of the public and the private actually working together. The games itself, why build a basketball stadium or a hockey stadium or a water polo stadium in London? Absolutely no point. We don't do those sports and it rains all the time, right? So build a basketball stadium, but build it to be demounted. At the moment, these are pictures of the thing being demounted, not being constructed. It's being designed to basically be taken apart. And Rio is now talking to London about possibly buying the whole stadium and taking it there. It doesn't matter whether it actually goes there. The most important thing is that all the material can be used in the future. There's another form of sustainability. Keep only the infrastructure that you need. We don't have a major velodrome, so we built one and that will remain there. Our dear friend Zaha Hadid built what I think is one of the most beautiful swimming pools in the world. I'm showing you an artist's impression because no one has seen this building yet, because the building itself has been designed to be retrofitted. If you remember, swimming is one of the most popular sports at the beginning. You need 17,000 seats. You don't want to go with your kids and have 16,950 empty seats for the rest of the legacy. So Zaha designed it in such a way, she calls it, in her voice, these ugly side wings. Right? She hates them, but it's fine, because they're actually now being taken away, and we'll go back to seeing what this wonderful structure is like, and the community can use it. And even the major stadium and this, rather ambiguous structure over here are going to remain as features for the future. So this whole project, and this is where I wanted to end, is actually not about the installations themselves or the buildings, but actually creating the spaces for community. When you take away all those temporary structures, you have cleaned up land, you have it well connected, you have it accessible, and it becomes the footprint for some of the images I'm now going to show you for the new neighborhoods. So here's an area. This is what it was like only a few months ago, the velodrome in the background with the Hargreaves Park. That's what's going to happen. You're going to have a sort of new crescent of housing designed by sort of younger architects in the UK. There's the velodrome in the background and a park in front of it. This is this massive sort of bridge that I showed you before connecting to the other side. This is James Corner's proposal of what might happen here in the future. And some of these things are actually now beginning to be realized, and that's how $400 million of the project budget is actually being spent. It was kept back to actually do this. So even here you see the Olympic Village on the left. This new housing scheme is now being constructed as we speak. 900 or so homes, some of which will be affordable. And actually, one of the most interesting things, this is where I want to conclude, is that just on the edge of the Olympic site, not in the site, one of the major universities in London, University College London, is now thinking of opening up a whole new campus, bringing something like 20,000 students, staff, and everything else that comes with a university to a part of London that was sort of forgotten. So in that sense, I think there's a story here about sustainability which goes way beyond the 2-week event, way beyond just the issues of physical infrastructure, green issues, very important, even though I've hardly actually touched upon them, but actually transform London in such a way that it rebalances the poor East and the rich West, so to speak, bringing that sort of level of investment that we can see here, and going from this, 2005, to that, but most importantly, over a 20, 30-year timescale to that. So in that sense, we're creating a sustainable infrastructure, which actually is part of the DNA of London that we've had there for a very long time. Thank you very much. Do I moderate the right, questions? Right, questions? We have about 7 minutes for questions.
Hi, Sandy Bear with Smart Cities Council. I'm so curious, as you study the evolution of a city or a city block, the genesis of it and how it morphs, are there elements that you could identify that say this place will become prosperous or deprived, or are there universal elements that you see?
I think it would be very rash and wrong to say that in any way the form, however important, of a city block determines prosperity. And I don't think that's how the correlation actually works. What I think in the work that we've done, and many others nonetheless sort of probably proves, is that there are certain forms of integrated, well-connected environments that if the other aspects of life which are so fundamental, the economy, jobs, prosperity, education, and issues that I've touched upon are there, provide that sort of possibility of integrated growth and interaction. What I'm really getting at is that, let's say there's the anti-city, the gated community, places of difference where people of different color, skin, belief systems, and wealth live separately from elsewhere, does not make a city, and therefore does not make that possibility of rubbing shoulders with people who are different and do different things. And I think that actually is a very important part of prosperity and provides innovation over time that you don't actually expect and can't plan for. much as we're talking to planners here, and perhaps I even end up wearing a bit of that hat, you cannot plan for making people either happy or rich, for sure. But you can certainly plan for not making people feel that they belong to a city. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of the emerging world environments, particularly designed as a result of fear. And that's an issue which I'm sure will come up later.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for an excellent talk. The question is on the London Green Belt. Is there a policy that has been implemented on the areas of the Green Belt, beyond the Green Belt?
Well, there have to be. Otherwise, you get what happens, for example, in Bogota, which is that property developers buy the land just outside, and you get the land speculation issue. Yes, that is exactly the case, and that is controlled by central government. And in fact, you were asking me this question literally in a week in which this is being debated by Parliament in the UK, because the new Conservative and Liberal Democrat government is looking at ways of effectively relaxing the planning framework to allow more housing to be built. And of course, one of the easy targets is the Green Belt. But the only way you can enforce that is to have stringent regulations in London that you can't go beyond. But that land outside the Green Belt for about 20 kilometers, roughly, is a no-go area. It's basically agricultural land, and to ask for change of use, you have to apply for planning permission to that local authority, but that will be designated as open, metropolitan open land on which you cannot build except for exceptional circumstances. So basically it is controlled from two layers of government, otherwise it wouldn't work. Lady over there.
Secretary Namioka, could you explain citizen participation process for the design process and citizens?
The
Citizen
participation
voice.
process for?
Citizen participation for design process.
But in the Olympics? Or
Your project.
for the Olympics, yeah. You know, behind that question lies a lot of sort of debate in the current discourse about participation. You know, who is it for and who's involved? That red line that I showed you from 2003, there were about, I think, 48 residents and about 400 companies actually working on the site, roughly that sort of order. The Olympic site, or the site which became the Olympics, never had a sort of housing community. The people who are going to live there, no one knows who they are, right? So the first block of the Olympic Village, which I just showed you on near the Westfield Shopping Centre, will in November this year go out to the market in terms of its first residents. So it is not known, as in many urban development projects, who the residents are going to be. So the question of consultation and participation is a complex one, in the sense that you couldn't talk to the future residents because you didn't know who they were. What certainly happened was a sort of dual process. One is that a top-down process. The red line basically was owned by an organization called the Olympic Delivery Authority, which gave itself planning powers. This is a very English trick of how to get things done, right? But because it's in the middle of 5 very dynamic London boroughs, so local authorities, there was very, very close collaboration with all of them in terms of what actually should be done here. In that sense, there was wide consultation with the boroughs themselves as opposed to the future inhabitants. But I think that's, you know, there's an issue of time and efficiency, which can lead to all sorts of negative sort of solutions, and then there's an issue of actual consultation. I have to say that, you know, the language I've been using about the nature of the place in London is a sort of, there's this complete shared consensus that this is what should be happening in East London. Many of the residents in the area feel this is a good thing. I mean, just think of the jobs. I haven't even had time to talk about the fact there's one major school with 2,000 students, which will be state school free. There are going to be 5 new junior schools, primary schools, health centers, etc. So let alone the sports facilities and the parks. So in terms of the sheer provision of excess infrastructure, new high-quality infrastructure for anyone who's living around there, let alone the people who are going to move into in the next 20, 30 years, is, you know, part of the carrot and not the stick approach to planning. Gentleman over there.
My name is Ronde and I work for the Technical Research Center of Finland. But I'm also born in Amsterdam, and my first remark about was, why, for heaven's sake, would you want to fit two Amsterdams in London? But that is maybe a sidestep. My question is, how do you mobilize this sort of effort without organizing an Olympics, basically? An Olympics. So I would like to take the Olympics out of the equations, because, I mean, you wouldn't really want to advise people all around the world to organize an Olympics.
There's a view London has, well, the UK has a press which is more violent, more aggressive than any of you from whatever country you come from in this room, right? So the British press has acted as the sort of, you know, the watchdog for a last number of years on these issues. And 7 years ago, the headlines, what a bloody waste of money, 9.3 billion could be spent on hospitals, on, you know, all that sort of thing. The tide has turned very much, and the general view in response to your question is that probably much of this would have happened because in response to the previous question, it's in the ethos of London, this rebalancing mode. You know, there's a tradition of a great humanist city. I mean, on the whole, the aberration is Canary Wharf. It's not this. I mean, I would say, if anything, the DNA of how London occupies space in a more organic way is, I think Moisen might agree, very much that. The major difference of the Olympic Games is it accelerated this process by about 70 years. That's what someone worked out. In other words, that you can kickstart it by putting in this infra. I mean, the mere issue of taking the pylons down and putting the... Now, I think a developer, if they were given the whole site at a cheap rate and, you know, saw that the London economy was going, could do that, but it would take a long time and a very courageous one to invest that sort of money up front. So what I would say in response to your question is that you don't need an Olympics to do these things. You need a vision and a mentality which prioritizes all the issues being addressed today. And next most important thing is you've got to think of it over 30, 35 years and not over 2 or 3, which then comes to the problem of the return on investment of any private company, which we'll talk about later. But I mean, you know, a belief in the public good is important, and a sort of shared sense that this is where we want to go is also significant. I think those things have aligned at the moment in sort of the London sort of planning and community debate. We're there? Thank you.